Absolutely amazing, ladies and gentlemen. That's Fess Parker. We are bringing George Washington back. A real hero, not Roger Staubach, not Michael Jordan. Hey, great, they can catch a ball, they can hit a ball, they can throw a ball through a hoop. That isn't what matters. You need to rediscover what this country is really all about. Now, before I get into George Washington and why the establishment hates him and why they don't really teach about him in school anymore or just tell you about his teeth being wooden and making fun of him, why the establishment is doing this. Because if you actually read what he said, learn what he did, and rediscover what America is, you know that it is the opposite of what government is today. And that if George Washington was alive today, he would probably already be in a shooting war with the government because the government is illegitimate and criminal. But we're in a different world. We need to circumvent that as long as we can and hopefully avert it. But it is time for all the corrupt people out there who have never really had it laid out in front of them, the real choices, to make their decision and decide who they stand with. The spirit of 1776 and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or with David Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, the New World Order. Now is the time to choose. Now is the time to relearn that incredible wisdom of the true revolutionary trailblazers, our founding fathers. Chief among them, General George Washington. So I want to play this clip of a breakdown by a historian in a live speech just a few months ago of George Washington. I'm quite the history buff on the Revolutionary War compared to the general public. It's so massive, I'm really a novice. This is very accurate about the Founding Fathers. For any of you that think you don't have the mettle to be part of this second revolution against tyranny, this restoration of the Republic, all you need to do is decide it's your destiny and set out to beat the New World Order and set your mind and your muscle and your will against them, and they will fall. Here it is.
We tend to see them, not just the people who figure in history books, Adams, Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Rush, and of course Washington. We tend to see them as sort of figures in a costume pageant. It's often the way they're portrayed. And we tend to see them as much older than they were, because we're seeing them in the portraits of Gilbert Stuart and others when they were truly the founding fathers. And furthermore, none of them had had any prior experience in revolutions. They weren't experienced revolutionaries who'd flown in to take part in this biggest of all events. They were winging it. They were improvising. At the time of the revolution, they were all young. It was a young man's, young woman's cause. George Washington took command of the Continental Army in the summer of 1775 at the age of 43. He was the oldest of them. Adams was 40. Jefferson was all of 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he wasn't chosen by his fellow members of the Continental Congress because he was a great military person. He was chosen because they knew him. They knew the kind of man he was. They knew his character, his integrity. What Washington was, above all, was a leader. He was a man people would follow. And as events would prove, he was a man whom a few would follow through hell. And he would not give up. He would not quit. The army was totally demoralized. They'd been defeated. They were soaking wet. They were cold. They were hungry. And by the time Washington started his big retreat, his long retreat across New Jersey, they were down to only a few thousand men. That's all. Well, Washington took stock, just as the British Army was taking stock of what the situation was, and most every officer and all the politicians, many of whom had fled from Philadelphia by this time. And most everybody concluded that the war was over and we had lost. It was the only rational conclusion one could come to. There wasn't a chance. So Washington did what you sometimes have to do when everything's lost and all hope's gone. He attacked. They went up the river Christmas night, 9 miles up to McConkey's Ferry. They crossed the Delaware. He had the nerve, the courage, the faith in the cause to carry the war once more to the enemy. And they marched 9 miles back down the river on the eastern side and struck at Trenton the next morning. It was a fierce house-to-house, savage battle, small in scale, but very, very severe. And it was all over in about 45 minutes, and we won. For the first time. Now, it wasn't a great battle like Brooklyn. This was a small engagement, but its consequences were enormous, beyond reckoning, because of the psychological effect. It transformed the attitude of the Army and of much of the country toward the war, and in that it was a pivotal turning point. Washington, the political general, had never forgotten that Congress was boss. When the war was at last over, Washington, in one of the most important events in our entire history, turned back his command to the Congress. No conquering general had done that before. When George III heard that George Washington might do this, King George III said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the original decision of the Continental Congress was the wise one. They knew the man, they knew his character, and he lived up to his reputation.
Now, compare that to what we've turned into today. We need to rediscover true liberty, true freedom, and virtue. And we need to understand that the globalists are not invincible with all their lies and corruption and manipulation, their control of the left and the right. We just had a giant victory. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the UN, Herman von Rompuy, head of the EU, announced global government is now being established. We're going to levy global carbon taxes. We're going to shut down industrial society. All announced this on TV. They said, we will pass it. And they failed because the fraud was leaked. And we're having many other victories. And in my experience, every time we fight, if we fight and fight and fight and persevere, if we lose 20 times and on the 21st time win, we win. It is the act of resistance that is victory when you have right on your side. Hundreds of battles were fought by the colonies. And you could do the numbers, but maybe 1 out of 15 were won. That's a guesstimation. Because some battles, it wasn't exactly clear who won, but the vast majority were won by the crown. But it was the perseverance, and it was waiting till the main British army was tied down with the French, and when their main fleet had been destroyed in the Atlantic. It was the fact that they bankrupt the coffers of King George III. And Hamilton and others came to Washington. What they don't tell you in that little short piece is they said, we want you to be king, a large contingent. And he said, no. And he left. He didn't want to be president, but the people wanted it. And then the second election, he got voted in. That's what the people wanted. He couldn't wait to get out of Washington. And in his farewell address, he said, don't get involved as an empire. Don't join alliances with other countries. They will come in and take us over. They will bring us down. Because the French had tried to come in and do that during his first and second term. And he went home to his farm and died 2 years later. He was offered to be the king of America. That's why Mexico's so corrupt today. They had kings. They had Austrian-Hungarian Empire kings. The kings of Europe would send their princelings there. And Mexico's run by a ruling shadow oligarchy today. Every other country has scum running it. North Korea. Everywhere. China has a bunch of corrupt thugs. Their people are good, but they didn't have George Washington. They didn't have Thomas Jefferson. The French and their revolution was a wicked counterfeit of what happened here. And they attempted to take that over through Washington, and he said no later. And that's a whole other history. But I think about how domesticated we've become in this country. I think about how all over the country, I see the reports, I talk to parents, I meet parents where they're scared of an orange Nerf gun, where the schools are banning tag and dodgeball and hugging or talking. We're all becoming prisoners under a psychiatric dictatorship. Mothers think it's good to make their sons and daughters cowards and helpless, to raise them up to be hapless weaklings like legless and armless gerbils in a cage, disarmed, defanged, so the boa constrictors of big government can eat them at their leisure.